This is the May 15th museum talk for the Vashon Maury Island Heritage Association. We are featuring Dr. Megan Asaka, where she will talk about maritime histories of race and labor, tracing histories from unheralded sites such as labor camps, lumber towns, lodging houses, and so-called slums. Dr. Asaka will discuss how migrant laborers worked alongside each other and forged unexpected alliances within the marine and coastal spaces of the Puget Sound. By uncovering the historical presence of marginalized groups and asserting their significance in the development of the region, Megan Asaka offers a deeper understanding of Seattle's complex past. I'd like to take a moment to give a little history about Megan. Her biography is that she is an associate professor of history at the University of California, where she specializes in Asian American history, urban history, and public humanities. She is the author of Seattle from the Margins, which reorients the early history of Seattle through the lens of those displaced and erased in the making of a city. Research for the book has been supported by numerous awards and fellowships, including the UC President's Faculty Research Fellowship in the Humanities. She has also worked extensively in the field of public history, including 5 years as an oral historian and archivist for Densho, a community-based organization that documents and shares the stories of Japanese American incarceration through an online archive and other digital platforms. We're honored that Megan joined us this month, and we welcome Chris Austin, board member of the Vashon Maury Island Heritage Association, to talk a little more about the museum.
Well, thank you, Cameron. What I'd like to start off with is a land acknowledgement, if I might. The Vashon Heritage Museum stands on the ancestral lands of the Shwabopes, or Swiftwater people, who inhabited Vashon Maury Island for millennia. The Donation Land Claim Act encouraged large numbers of settlers to claim land even before the Medicine Creek Treaty of 1854 extinguished native claims to it. The Shwabopes were imprisoned on Fox Island during the Puget Sound Treaty Wars by the territorial government and later relocated on the Puyallup Reservation. We acknowledge the people of the Puyallup tribes whose stewardship of and relationship with Vashon Maury Island continues today. We commit to amplify the voices of Indigenous people, making space for them to tell their own story, both past and present, in our exhibits and programs. Thank you, Cameron.
Thanks so much, Chris. And before Megan starts her talk, I will recite our mission statement. The mission of the Vashon Maury Island Heritage Association is to honor Vashon stories of love, life, oppression, action, and resilience. The association tells Vashon stories, encouraging islanders to take responsibility for what we do, knowing our actions influence history. As the association collects, preserves, and exhibits and interprets the history of Vashon and Maury Islands, we seek to engage, educate, and inspire our island community. We're grateful again to welcome Megan as part of this mission. Thank you, Megan, for your time today.
Thank you so much to Cameron for inviting me and for all of you who are joining me today for this talk. I grew up in Seattle, so my family has been in Seattle for I think over 100 years. So it's always a pleasure for me to come back, I guess virtually, and speak to folks in the Seattle area because it's a city that I love. And I live in California now, but I feel like my heart is always in the Pacific Northwest. And so the ideas, Cameron mentioned my book, Seattle from the Margins, which I have here to show folks. And, you know, the ideas that I explore in my book really do come from my own upbringing in Seattle. So Seattle played a role not only as the topic of my book, but also in the inspiration behind the book, because what I witnessed and kind of absorbed growing up is that there was a real contrast between the story that Seattle tells about itself, which is a city that is a progressive city, as an open-minded city, as a city that's in some ways exceptional when it comes to race and existing almost outside of a fraught racial history of other American cities. And then I had the story of my family, which I come from a Japanese American family on my dad's side, who were in Seattle, were removed from Seattle following Pearl Harbor, Executive Order 9066, incarcerated. And then when they returned, they really weren't welcomed back with open arms at all and really struggled. And so it was that tension between, I think, the sort of story that Seattle told about itself that I was familiar with growing up, and then the family history that I knew really drove me to research this book and to write what I felt like would be a more inclusive history of Seattle, and a history that really tries to grapple a little bit more with the complex history that it sounds like folks are doing really great work at the museum today on Vashon. So I wanted to be part of that conversation. And so what I wanted to focus on today, and again, given my audience, folks who are either on Vashon or familiar with the island, is Seattle's maritime history. It's maritime geography, being at the center of Puget Sound and the broader Salish Sea, and how that fostered a particular kind of economy and labor force, which was oriented around water. And so I think, as someone who grew up in Seattle, and obviously for folks who are living on Vashon, this maritime perspective, I feel, is really lacking in histories of, Western history and urban history, and even other studies of Seattle, which tend to privilege land, which tend to privilege, the stories of settlers who are kind of moving from east to west on the Oregon Trail, for example, stories of the railroad, in some ways unfolding in this kind of linear narrative that moves from the east to the west. And this is very common in approaches to Western history, approaches to urban history, very dominant in how scholars even have told the story of our region. And this, I talk about this in my book, this really does not make a lot of sense when it comes to Seattle, when it comes to the Pacific Northwest. 'Cause first of all, when you look at Seattle history, Seattle did not receive a connection to the Transcontinental Railroad until 1893. So this is long after the city had kind of developed into, a major metropolis, and long after the economy had actually started to expand. So the railroad history here does not really apply in the case of Seattle. It doesn't play as important of a role, I think, as scholars have attributed to, the role of the railroad and sort of sparking this, kind of urbanization and, westward expansion, et cetera. And second, when we focus so much on the railroad and so much, I think, on land-based stories, we're also privileging a settler perspective. So settlers become the main actors in terms of how we're narrating Seattle history, in terms of how we're narrating how Seattle came to be, in terms of like whose voices we're elevating, in terms of, the important actors in early Seattle history. And this leaves out many others, including Indigenous voices, including Asian voices, people who were crucial to building the city, building the region, but who have really been omitted from the larger history of Seattle and in some ways in the region itself. And so a maritime perspective, right, really focusing on the water, focusing on the waterways, the Salish Sea, can really illuminate, I think, a more diverse understanding of our past and highlighting what I would say are the true creators here at the heart of Seattle history. I'm really, in my book, telling a story that goes really beyond the settlers, that goes beyond the businessmen, that goes beyond the people, those kind of elites whose names and stories that we know because they're attached to street names, they're attached to buildings, right? They're told in various textbooks, et cetera. So I'm really looking at kind of the stories that have been erased, the stories that have been marginalized. And one way to do that, I would say, is really to focus on water and to focus on the waterways of the Salish Sea and use that to open up a new understanding of our past. So I'm just going to share my screen really quick to show some slides. Okay, there we go. So again, we have to really look at a maritime geography and environment when we're talking about Puget Sound history, when we're talking about Seattle history, to really get into the origins of the of Seattle as a city. And one thing that I really focus on in early chapters of my book is the Salish Sea, of course, which, as I'm sure a lot of you know here, given the audience, but it is this large body of water. It's I'm showing it here in a map, which spans from Canada all the way down through Washington. Includes the Strait of Georgia, the Strait of Juan de Fuca, the Puget Sound, and Seattle, of course, is located right here, kind of right in the middle of a very central location within the Sound. Access to many of the islands of the Sound. So here, Bainbridge and Vashon are highlighted in this map. And again, Seattle has this kind of, access to Canada, has access to the Pacific Ocean, Alaska, California, Hawaii, and from there, broader Asia and the Pacific world. And so, when we look at maps of the United States showing the railroad, Seattle really doesn't appear in these maps. But when we look actually at the water and we look at the Pacific Ocean, we look at the Salish Sea, Seattle becomes actually a very important city in terms of how we're looking at this time period, right? The 19th century and early 20th century. Again, this map really can start to tell us something different, and also how important the Pacific world was in Seattle's kind of early development as a city. The Pacific was hugely important, both the Pacific Rim, California, all the way up to Alaska, as well as the Pacific Islands, as well as Asia, right? So this region actually is hugely important in terms of understanding Seattle's history. The other thing I want to mention before I move on are the various rivers, right? Which I also talk about, in which this will come up because I'm going to talk a little bit about agriculture. Seattle also is at the convergence point of many different rivers. So we see all of these rivers here that are flowing from the Cascade Mountains and flowing into the Puget Sound. So all the way north, the Nooksack, all the way south to the Nisqually. We have just a region that is just flanked with so many rivers. And so Seattle was important not only in terms of its location along the Puget Sound and with access to the Pacific Ocean, to Canada, to Alaska, to California, but also because it was at this kind of convergence point of the many different rivers on the eastern side of this map here. As you can see, all these different rivers. So indeed, Seattle was a stopping over place for Coast Salish peoples since time immemorial. In fact, in Lushootseed, which is the language of Puget Sound Coast Salish peoples, the place that would become Seattle was actually called Little Crossing Over Place. It was used as a convergence point for many different tribal communities who all moved around by water. And this gave rise to an incredibly fluid and dynamic Indigenous society anchored around the waterways of the Salish Sea. So people moved around a lot. They intermarried and they traveled great distances to visit kin, to gather resources, and to socialize during the winter months. The summer months, while the winter months were spent in permanent villages. And so this is kind of the role that Seattle played much later on in the 19th and early 20th century, as the city was establishing itself, it continued that role as a stopping over place for workers and migrants as they moved around the region in search of jobs. And they were kind of traversing these routes that had been carved out by Indigenous peoples since time immemorial. And so, it's what I want to make the point is a much older system, much older geography than actual Seattle's urban history. And this is a history that goes back much farther, I think, than the more recent phase, right, of Seattle's history, 19th and 20th century. So a maritime history, and again, looking at this map and centering water and looking at the Salish Sea can also really help us to understand the Asian presence in the Pacific Northwest also. So Asians, obviously have a much different history than Indigenous peoples. Asians are newcomers, right? They're immigrants. They were not the first peoples of the region. And yet their story also very much revolved around water. So Asian folks started coming over from Asia to the Pacific Northwest starting in the 1860s. And of course, they were traveling by steamship. They were traveling across the Pacific, taking that 3-week, 4-week journey in these huge steamships across the Pacific, landing either in Vancouver or in Seattle, and then taking smaller vessels, smaller boats, traversing those waterways again around the Salish Sea. So this is important because, as I'll talk about, the early workforce of the Pacific Northwest was Indigenous and Asian workers. And the reason why, I would argue, is because these workers were moving around by water. This was a maritime economy, it was a maritime geography, and the workers in the 19th and early 20th century, and even beyond, were all moving around by water. And so when the city of Seattle started to develop and kind of started to urbanize in the 1850s, Indigenous and Asian workers comprised the bulk of the workforce. And also help this waterways also helps us to understand why the particular economy in the Northwest emerged as it did. So in the Northwest, from the 19th through the early 20th century, the economy really revolves around the extraction of natural resources and agriculture, logging, lumber processing, fishing, salmon canning, coal mining, hops, and berry picking. Seattle served as a hub of migration for workers and others passing through the city to and from the labor camps and lumber towns dotting the region's hinterlands. They also stayed in Seattle temporarily during the winter months as these seasonal industries slowed their operations. And so again, one of the things I talk about in my book is that Seattle's roots as a city had to do with its location along the Salish Sea and its historic role as a convergence point or as a hub of migration. And this is what kind of Seattle's role was from the 19th century through the 20th century and beyond. So in this in these types of industries, the workers that were really desired were mobile, right? They could move around from place to place. They were desired as much for their mobility as for their actual labor. And so Seattle kind of developed as this, again, this hub of labor migration to feed the broader regional economy, which revolved around these industries like agriculture, like the salmon canneries, like fishing, which was very seasonal and required this kind of very short-term mobile labor force. So I wanted to, in the remaining time, talk about kind of one of these industries, which was agriculture. And I know agriculture has a particular history, Vashon Island, and other islands like it. I talk a lot in my book about Bainbridge Island. And agriculture is very interesting, actually, because it's also one of these examples that is so sort of tied to the land and understood as very much a land-based industry. And yet the waterways of the Puget Sound, including the river systems that I talked about, really help to explain why agriculture was such an important part of the Pacific Northwest and why Seattle specifically emerged as a center of agricultural employment. So many people don't know this, but hop farming, right, was the biggest industry in the Pacific Northwest and in really the Seattle area during the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s. So hops is the main ingredient used for flavoring beer. And it was Seattle's first major industry. It was really, really popular. It was reported on like nationally, also internationally. So hops came to the Northwest in the 1860s. There was a kind of like blight, I think, in New England where hops had been typically grown that wiped out the hop crop in that region. So it came to the Pacific Northwest. And we see that, how the question is, how were sort of growers even making this happen? Because Seattle at the time did not have land-based transportation. It did not have a railroad. But we do see that settlers who were taking advantage of, as was mentioned earlier in the land acknowledgement, right? Like the homesteading, the Donations Claims Act, to really appropriate Indigenous land. They were using that to establish farms along the banks of major rivers, the Puyallup River, the White River, for example, and then using that to move their products, move their goods all around the world, and also to attract workers. So we see that the early workforce of hop farms were indigenous workers. First, indigenous workers from around the Puget Sound region, people who were more local, and then over time, indigenous workers from as far away as Alaska would come, again, using those waterways of the Salish Sea, coming again as far north as Alaska to come work in the hops industry. And so this mobility was really crucial to enabling the entire system of hop farming to happen, because hops in some ways, and I've done a lot of research into this, much more than I thought I would ever know about hops. I now know. It was sort of a difficult crop in the sense that it was finicky to grow. It depended a lot on the weather, the temperature. And so sometimes you could have the harvest in September, sometimes it could be early October, sometimes it could be early September. It was really hard to predict. And so that mobility of the workforce was really key in terms of allowing this industry to expand. And it's one of the reasons why I argue, the Puget Sound region in the 1860s and 1870s kind of became the center, global center of hop picking and hops production. And so indigenous workers, as I mentioned, became the primary workforce in the 1860s and 1870s. And again, this first started out in a very kind of locally, right? It was a lot of Puget Sound, Coast Salish peoples were involved in the harvest, were, picking hops. And then again, it really expanded. I think there are several reasons. There were hop growers would actually send recruiters up to Canada, up to Vancouver areas. That was one, but also just word of mouth. This kind of availability of this particular labor spread around the region, again, going really far north along the Northwest coast. And so here I want to mention that Seattle played a really important role. And this is a really interesting photograph here. It's taken from the 1890s. This is a UW Special Collections photograph. And this is Seattle. It's showing the waterfront. Of course, the waterfront now does not look like this. Again, there was a lot of kind of, various urban projects that happened along the waterfront since, so it does not look like this now. But this was back in the 1890s, the foot of Washington Street. So this would have been kind of around Pioneer Square area today. But you can see this was a popular docking area for indigenous workers. As they were coming from Alaska, they were coming from Canada, they were coming from around the Sound, they would dock at this location and go into the downtown Seattle to purchase supplies, to stock up on food. And then a little bit farther away, there were some camping areas along the waterfront near, again, downtown area where they would camp out for a few days, even a few weeks, and then, go on to the fields. And again, this is Puyallup, White River, and areas around that region. And Seattle also was a kind of employment center where growers would come up to Seattle specifically to recruit workers. And they would come right to this area here, right here. And again, it's interesting to note the details on this photograph. You can see the big crowd that was gathered. And it was an exciting time for the city. So growers would come to Seattle and use this as an opportunity to recruit pickers. So they would recruit 50, they would recruit 100 pickers, they would recruit 200 pickers to come down, to the Puyallup Valley, to the White River Valley, and work on these farms for the 3-week, 1-month picking season. And so indeed, it's really interesting to read the newspapers from the time, because sightings of canoe fleets were widely reported on in the local press, because it signaled the beginning of hop picking season, and it signaled the beginning of what was a huge opportunity for businesses, actually, and people who were selling things in Seattle to a business opportunity, because they would get workers who were coming in who were buying supplies to bring to the hop fields with them. They were buying food. And so it was kind of this, opportunity, this business opportunity. And I have a quote here from 1879. And this is from the Seattle Times. A local journalist noted, the bay and its shores were dotted and lined with canoes, while the storefronts and sidewalks downtown were thick with quote unquote Indians themselves. So this just speaks to, I think, the importance of this migration, the importance of Indigenous presence in the city in terms of kind of stimulating actually the Seattle economy at the time, especially during the summer months. And so Indigenous workers who were traveling, right, from far distances and engaging in, agricultural work were really doing this migrations that had always been done, right, had been done historically for many, many generations. Hop growers were kind of capitalizing on this. And in some ways, this is sort of what I would argue turned Seattle into this kind of employment center that really expanded in the later decades. And so I have, in my book, a lot more detail about this for folks who are interested about how the bargaining worked, how the employment contracts worked, right? What the kind of like day-to-day labor looked like on the hop fields. But I wanted to stress that, this was actually very attractive work for a lot of Indigenous workers. Again, one of the reasons why we see so many coming from, again, very far distances, because it allowed them to weave their own agendas into the work itself. It allowed them to engage in canoe travel with family. Again, this was very much a family workforce. Families would come down together, enabled them to socialize, and allow them to engage in cultural practices, such as conversing in their native languages, that these practices were being suppressed at the time, heavily punished even by missionaries and by government agents who were, in charge of the reservations and the reserves, right, and what they call reservations in Canada. So it was a kind of a way for these workers to pursue autonomy and also to earn a wage at the same time. And what we do see is that often Indigenous workers would engage in fishing or even sometimes working at the canneries in the summer months. And then they would tack on a trip to Seattle and then working in the hop fields in kind of usually September. So they had their own reasons for wanting to do this work and for why it appealed to them. So Chinese workers, in addition, also played a role in the early agricultural industry in the Puget Sound region, specifically hop picking, and this isn't often a story that people are familiar with. Often we think about Chinese workers in the 19th century, we think of the railroad. In the Northwest, they did play an important role in agriculture as migrant workers. So Chinese migrants started to come to Seattle in the 1860s. Pretty small numbers at that point. They became much more populous by the 1870s. Again, this was an era in the 1870s of industrialization across the United States that drew many Chinese folks to the United States. And they performed a lot of that labor, right, that fed the industrial economy. Of course, railroads, canneries, and also in the urban workforce doing construction, for example. In the Pacific Northwest, though, given the particular sort of nature of the economy around resource extraction and agriculture, Chinese workers often labored in these kind of seasonal jobs, in these highly mobile jobs in agriculture and resource extraction. And this is where we see a lot of connections being made between Chinese and Indigenous workers. So there's a lot of connection between these two groups, which again is not often highlighted at all, who were working in very similar jobs. They were living in very similar kinds of communities, and they were coming into contact all the time. Right. And so that's a story that I also tell. Just to pause here for a minute. This is a photograph of an encampment in the Puyallup Valley that you would see everywhere, right? It's a very common site in the 1880s, just showing kind of what that looked like at the time, right? In the 1880s. Again, this is Puyallup Valley. This is what an example of a kind of labor camp would look like. And so Chinese labor was also very much centered in Seattle. Seattle was a hub of Chinese migration. It was a hub of Chinese labor services. And the Chinese workforce was structured much more, I would say, than indigenous labor around labor contracting. So we see these businesses start to open up, like this one I'm showing here in this slide. This is Chin-Gi He, one of Seattle's first and most prominent, I would say, Chinese residents of the 19th century. And they opened businesses that were called employment agencies or labor contracting firms that entered into these contracts with industrial sort of firms, employers like, railroads, for example, canneries, and of course, growers, right? Farmers. So these Chinese labor contractors like Chin-Gi He, pictured here, would actually recruit Chinese workers, and often they operated offices on both sides of the Pacific. They would have an office in Hong Kong and Seattle and Vancouver. They would recruit workers, they would bring them over, and then they would kind of funnel them into the workforce, right? In the Pacific Northwest, again, a lot of this work was in the canneries, it was in agriculture. It was definitely in railroad construction as well. And this was desirable from the employer's perspective because it allowed them to almost outsource their labor needs, and in many cases, the most dangerous and undesirable work, to these Chinese contractors who would then manage everything. They would recruit the workers, they would oversee their labor, they would pay them, right? And so it was a very useful kind of system. It was also very exploitative, as you can probably imagine. So growers also used, in the hops industry, Seattle as a hub of employment for Chinese workers. It was where they were going to procure workers, for the 3-week, 4-week picking season. Again, Chinese workers were also moving around by water. They were also moving around these smaller vessels and smaller boats of the Salish Sea. They were coming over in these big steamships. And so that was another reason why we see Chinese workers becoming these desirable laborers, especially in agriculture. And so, oftentimes what we see with Chinese workers is that hop growers would go directly to the canneries, actually, and they would recruit from the canneries. So Chinese workers were heavily overrepresented in salmon canning. And then they would kind of make an agreement to come, back down to, come to the Seattle area and then move on to hop picking, for example. So we see, again, the ways that these different industries are almost working kind of together to provide this very temporary, highly mobile workforce. So by the 1880s, early 1880s, we have a agricultural workforce around the Seattle area that is it's multiracial, predominantly Indigenous and Chinese. And I found one census that was conducted in the Puyallup and White River valleys in 1879 that counted 1,000, and they just said, quote unquote, Indian pickers, and 300 Chinese pickers present. And this kind of ratio was very common in the agricultural workforce. And I should say that hop picking also appealed to Chinese workers as well, for somewhat different reasons. But hop picking was not as physically taxing as other forms of labor. So often you would have these big vines on poles, and you would take the pole and lay it on the ground. And so you could sit on the ground, you could sit in a chair, and pick the cones off of the vine. So at least you could sit, right? It didn't require long periods of standing. And so it was actually desirable work because it was not as physically taxing as other forms of labor. And it also allowed workers, Chinese workers, to, again, have this kind of autonomous experience. They could set up camps, they could gather, they could socialize on their own. And so it was kind of felt like, in some ways, this appealing work compared, of course, with cannery work or railroad work or the other types of work that Chinese laborers often did. So this is a really good example, I think, of how this maritime environment of the Salish Sea gave rise to a particular economy, a particular labor force, Indigenous and Asian workers who are moving around by water, and then the centrality of Seattle in facilitating this system, right? This is an era when Seattle really emerges as an important hub of employment and of labor migration for these particular industries. And I just quickly, I wanted to make the point that this is important too, because oftentimes in Seattle history, we hear about the gold rush, right? The Klondike gold rush. That's hugely important. I think there's even a museum, right? A Klondike history museum in Seattle in Pioneer Square. And this story of the gold rush, right, the 1890s, when all of these people from around the world converged on Seattle to go up to try their luck in the gold mines of Alaska and the Yukon, is often cited as the moment when Seattle kind of became this important city because it was this metropolis, it was this stopping over place. And yet I wanted to highlight, if we look back several decades and we actually look at waterways and we look at Indigenous voices, we look at Asian voices, we're actually seeing this happening a lot earlier. And then this is another example of how we can actually start to destabilize the sort of white male miner as the most important figure in early Seattle history, and actually turn towards, right, Indigenous voices again and Asian voices for those early origins. And if you're interested in this hops industry and agriculture, I have a chapter about it in my book again, and I get into it because what happens is we see a decline of agriculture actually in the 1880s, certainly by the 1890s. Part of that is labor. I'm sure many of you know that there was immigration restrictions passed against the Chinese, including the Chinese Exclusion Act, among others. Chinese were actually subjected to a lot of violence as well. And so this, had an impact on the Chinese population, Chinese community in the Northwest. There was also this blight of the hop crop in the Puget Sound region, and so it made it really hard to grow. Hops actually moved over the Cascade Mountains to Yakima, where actually Yakima is still today this global center of hop production. So that happened around the 1890s, kind of early 20th century, when agriculture ceased to be such an important part of Seattle's economy in particular. And that's when we see Eastern Washington become a kind of agricultural center. But I should say the caveat here. Oh, and here's an interesting, sorry, the quality of this photograph is not very good, but you can see this is a Chinese encampment of the hops encampment. I think this is 1883. Yeah. I mean, you can see the tents and you can kind of see Chinese workers here in the front who are gathered. But this is one of the few examples that I could find in the photographic record, actually, of Chinese hop pickers. Again, because there was a lot of violence that drove them out of this particular industry in the 1880s, there is not a lot of photographic evidence left of their presence. So I wanted to note that as well. So what we do see is agriculture starting to move away from the Seattle region, away from the Puget Sound region. And so by the 1920s and 1930s, agriculture no longer played such an important role in the economy of Western Washington, which started to become oriented much more around shipbuilding, really around the lumber industry. And lumber, employed 2/3 of Washington's workforce by 1920. It was huge. However, there was an exception to this. And this is where, again, the story of waterways and the story of islands become very important, because Japanese farmers actually played a very important role in maintaining agriculture in Western Washington, and specifically the Puget Sound region, really beginning in the early 20th century and all the way through, again, 1942, and then even after World War II. And so by the 1920s and 30s, Japanese farmers were operating some of the only remaining farms in Western Washington. We have some Italians and some kind of like Euro-American, like white farmers operating farms, but the Japanese immigrants were very, very active in this particular industry and operating, again, some of the only farms that were remaining in Western Washington. So the story of Japanese immigrants coming to Seattle, coming to the Pacific Northwest, really started in the 1890s in big numbers. And that was when Seattle established a direct shipping route from Seattle to Yokohama. And so Japanese immigrants originally arrived as a labor force to replace the Chinese, who, again, as I mentioned, had been subjected to immigration restriction and racial violence. And so they were no longer a source of labor for canneries, for railroads, for these industrial projects, and for agriculture, and the lumber industry also. And yet, Japanese immigrants also had a bit of a different trajectory than the Chinese because of the status of Japan. Remember, Japan was a global power in the early 20th, beginning in the early 20th century with its own empire. And so the United States, it's interesting to think about this, but the United States in the early 20th century was very concerned about its relationship with Japan and wanting to appease Japan in some ways, to not anger Japan. The US and Japan were allies during World War I. And so, the United States was a bit more lenient for a while, at least, in terms of its immigration laws. And one major difference here was that Japanese women were allowed to immigrate to the United States as long as they were married to someone who was a Japanese person who was in the United States already. This was not available to Chinese women. So because of this, Japanese immigrants had many more families and a more balanced kind of gender ratios, right, between men and women, and then children, than the Chinese community did, which was really, really cut off. Women were not allowed in. And so they began to form families. And with those families, we see Japanese immigrants begin to open small businesses that revolve around this family workforce. Farms were one of them. I talk about in my book, hotels and other urban businesses, but farms were another very, very common occupation. And so I don't get into Vashon history specifically, but I do talk about Bainbridge Island, which has somewhat of a similar history to Vashon in terms of the kind of like bigger trends. And so what we see is that on Bainbridge, for example, Japanese immigrants start out by working at Port Blakely, which is a sawmill, right? So they work for many years. They're able to save up enough money to send for, a bride from Japan. They get married, they form a family, and then they're able to save up enough money to sometimes buy land. And again, Washington had alien land laws, which prevented quote unquote aliens, which was code for Asian, from owning property. And yet we do see in Bainbridge, for example, many Japanese immigrants were successful at buying land or circumventing the restrictions of the alien land law by, for example, putting the property in the name of their American-born children who could legally own land, of course. And so Japanese Americans were often kind of, in some ways, pushed into these niche crops, right? They were really, because of racial exclusion and the restrictions on how difficult it was to kind of buy land, they often had smaller farms, right, in terms of acreage. And the crops that they were growing tended to be crops that white farmers weren't interested in as much. So these were things like strawberries, of course. I know Vashon, also Bainbridge, Bellevue has a huge history in terms of Japanese Americans growing strawberries. Also things like cut flowers, right? Flowers that were cut and sold as cut flowers, often locally or in Seattle. And labor-wise, right, we do see Japanese farmers not really employing white workers, right? Hop growers sometimes employed white women and children. Actually, Japanese farmers did not employ white workers. They either worked the farm themselves, and then during harvest season would employ indigenous workers and also Filipino workers. So this became the major labor force of Japanese farmers, at least on Bainbridge, were indigenous and Filipino laborers. And, for indigenous workers, hopefully I've, laid out this history where migration was part of this historical process of migration and historical experience of migration. There was a history in this region of migration, long-standing and also more recent in terms of hop picking. So again, it was a sort of long-standing tradition in the Northwest. And so we do see that this continued, right, in places like Bainbridge, where agricultural labor was performed a lot by Coast Salish workers. And many of them actually coming from Canada, from the Vancouver region, Suquamish and other folks, who were kind of, either being recruited by Japanese farmers directly, or, Japanese farmers would do the same thing that their predecessors had, which was going to Seattle as a center of employment, recruiting workers from there. And so we do see that Seattle persists as this hub of migration for Indigenous agricultural workers who are stopping over in Seattle on their way to harvest on the islands. This time, often like the ferry system and cars were more common. But again, still part of this maritime world. And so on these farms, Japanese farmers also employed large numbers of Filipino men, starting in the 1920s and 30s. So Seattle was also a main hub of Filipino migration to the Northwest, starting in the 20s. And again, if you're interested in more details about this history, I write about it in my book. Due to the U.S. colonization of the Philippines, right? The Philippines was a colony of the United States. And so we have a kind of direct linkage from the Philippines to the US. Seattle was a central hub of Filipino migration. Many of the Filipinos who came were young men, like the one pictured here, wanting to pursue education, but their arrival coincided with, of course, the Great Depression. And so many of them struggled to find work. They couldn't fund their educations. They were also subjected to a lot of racism and discrimination in employment. And so we do see Filipinos searching, very far for jobs in this era, in the 1930s, the Depression era. And a lot of Japanese farmers would go to Seattle and recruit Filipino workers to work on their farms, hiring them either for the picking season or sometimes even for longer term kind of managerial positions on their farms. And so by the 1930s, we have a very interesting agricultural landscape where most of the farms are operated by Japanese immigrants and their families, relying on the labor of Filipino and Indigenous workers. And so one thing that we see is the formation of a lot of romantic relationships and a lot of marriages, actually, between Filipino Indigenous women and Filipino men, resulting in these mixed communities that are really interesting. This is a photograph of the Kitamoto family farm, strawberry farm. Again, this is the late 1930s. This is, I think, one of the younger Kitamoto daughters with a Filipino worker who I believe went on, this was also common, worked for the Kitamoto family for a few years, went on to lease his own farm with his brother on Bainbridge. Again, this was a kind of common, movement for Filipino men. I thought this was interesting. And here is a picture. Actually, this is a picture of Vashon. And I love this photograph. I include it in my book. Again, I don't have as much about Vashon in my book, but I loved you can see the sound, right? You can see the sound in the distance. And this is a group of Indigenous workers who are picking strawberries on a Vashon Island farm. This was 1943. And so, again, I have more details about this in my book. And note the date 1943. So what happened was, of course, Pearl Harbor, Executive Order 9066, the mass removal and incarceration of Japanese Americans. And so what we do see in some cases are Filipino workers and who are either managers or neighbors, right, of Japanese American farmers actually taking over and managing their farms while they're incarcerated. So that did happen actually on Bainbridge. So there was a kind of history there of, I think, collaboration or shared sense of struggle, among these different groups, even though there were also a lot of tensions too. And I do talk about that in my book. I do talk about the tensions that existed between Japanese American farmers and their multiracial workforce. So these, just in the interest of time, I'm wrapping up. So these are just a couple of snapshots of agriculture, and in particular, the role of water in shaping the agricultural industry in the Puget Sound region, as well as these patterns of migration and labor and, family formation even. And so I want to stress the importance here of, okay, so it's why did I focus so much on water? Well, I think it's one of the ways we can see how it's very important that we start to look at different ways of understanding our past, whose voices are viewed as worthy of remembrance, and how we continue to be creative in pushing the boundaries of how we tell our history, our regional history, our urban history, and who we are including in that history. And so in this case, what we see by looking at the water and looking at the role of the Maritime in shaping Seattle history is that Indigenous and Asian workers played a much bigger role in the origins of Seattle, I think, than previously acknowledged. And so my book really discusses many more stories like this. I do believe it's on sale for sale online if anyone is interested. But thank you so much for your time, and I welcome any questions that you have. Thank you all. Cameron, you're muted, I think.
Thank you. I'm honored to learn from you. I want, before we get to the questions, to thank Dr. Asaka for conducting this research, for sharing these beautiful insights about the 19th century maritime labor practices. Your important work helps people learn about the connections between Indigenous and Chinese people in the workforce of the Salish Sea, as well as your exploration of the Japanese and Filipino working side by side. It helps us reflect on our history and discover what it means for us today. We have a couple of questions. One is if you know if your book will be turned into an audiobook.
I have not heard any plans for that. That would be great, but it's up to my publisher, and I don't think they have any plans for that as of now. But I will let you know if those plans change. Thank
Great.
you.
And the questioner, Sarah, I'll be in touch with a couple of links to other ways you can learn from Megan. I saw a couple of other YouTube videos, some quite recent. So if we do, we can still learn from her, even if the audio would be preferable for you for now. Then a question from Bruce Hallman, who is the president of the Heritage Association. He's interested to know about what captured your imagination. Like, how did you study in undergrad and grad school to learn to want to research this?
Yeah, that's such an interesting question. Like looking back on my journey and like my trajectory, like how I got here, it was not always something that made sense to me at the time, but definitely makes sense to me now that I'm looking back. And so I was always interested in family history, specifically in my Japanese American family, feeling like I never quite got enough in school. And of course, I was growing up in the 80s and 90s, and there's more understanding of that history now, I think. But when I was growing up, it was like nothing. And so I was always very curious for more information, often going to my own sources to find that information myself. And so really it emerged for a drive for knowledge that I felt was missing. And then my question in college was, why is this missing? Why do we know certain stories so well? And why are others just erased or invisible? And so that was really something I thought a lot about in college. And then after college, I worked at Densho, the Densho Project. For those of you who don't know, it's a wonderful organization, Seattle-based, and it's an online archive, so everything is digital, of oral histories, photographs, and historic documents and records that tell the story of Japanese American history with a focus on incarceration. And so I worked there for a long time, and that was great because then I was learning more about my own community, and I felt like I was contributing to, I guess like a broader understanding of that for future generations, for students and teachers. But I became actually more interested in doing my own research because Densho was, a community-based organization. It was a collective project. And I felt really compelled to return to the question of Seattle and really write a book about Seattle that I felt was really missing and that I felt like would have really meant a lot to me as someone growing up in the city. And one of those things I wanted to highlight was a more diverse Seattle history than is usually told. I'm very interested in like multiracial stories and kind of diverse stories of different groups of people who come together and sometimes in conflict, but often in cooperation, and how that was also missing in terms of Seattle history. I was really interested in highlighting more diverse voices, again, maybe because of my own upbringing. But that led me to grad school and then where I am now.
Thank you. I popped the Densho URL into the chat for anyone who wants more information. I have a couple more questions if you have any more time for us.
Sure, of course.
Okay. Um, we have a question that is also from Bruce Hallman, and he's asking, what do you see as the next step beyond the Chinese, Japanese, Filipino sequence of immigration? And what he wanted to know a little about what followed post World War II.
Yeah, so thank you for this. I actually teach a class in immigration history focusing on Asian Americans. So this is
Oh,
actually right up my
good.
alley. Yes. So what we do see is that during and after World War II, immigration laws start to loosen a little bit. And this is the era when we begin to see like Japanese women, war brides, military brides start to immigrate. That's a big population of Japanese immigration. We also begin to see refugees coming from specifically from Cold War sort of China. And then 1965 is really the era when immigration laws completely change. A lot of restrictions are dropped. And that's when we get the really big second wave of immigration from Asia. That immigration is very different from the earlier era that I talked about, which was labor migration, and specifically kind of like low wage labor, people who, often single men, young men. These immigrants were, because of the immigration laws, were much more highly educated, and they had specialized, often higher degrees in specialized fields such as medicine, medical professionals, engineering, science, technology. And so that's why we see a very different kind of group of immigrants coming. Again, they're very connected to the economy in that way. And then the third group that's important for Seattle history are Southeast Asian refugees. So Seattle in the 1970s became another hub of Southeast Asian refugee migration because of the Vietnam War and the war in Southeast Asia. Seattle, again, was a hub. There is a little Saigon, in Seattle that is kind of right next to it's Chinatown International District. So that was another really important group of not immigrants, but migrants who came to, the Seattle area from Asia.
Great. We have lots of interest in your book specifically, so I've been telling titles and URLs of where they can find it. And we have a lot of gratitude here, and thank you for coming to join us. And I see that Keith Pryor, who is a beloved docent, has his hand up. But Keith, I don't know how to have you participate. If you could type in the chat. I would love to hear from you. Keith is also a retired professor from the UC, and maybe he taught at your college. That would be fun. Keith, are you still interested? I'll I'll make sure and connect you too if that's what it's about. I see his hand. Oh, his hand is down now. In this virtual space, it's interesting to do this part.
Oh, you know what? I see his question. Is this Keith Pryor?
Yes.
Yes, I see it. Okay.
Oh, good.
The first question is about Angel Island. Immigrant entrances to the Pacific Northwest, David Matsumoto. David Matsumoto did a book on the help that white farm owners did to sustain the farms of detained Japanese in the San Joaquin Valley. Are there similar stories around the Puget Sound? So yeah, that's it. So the question is kind of about like what happened to the Japanese American farms during World War II. It really varies. It's like a case by case basis. And I'm actually working on a project now that looks at Bellevue and kind of how, because there were some farmers that actually returned to Bellevue after World War II. But I don't know exactly how that happened. I do know individual stories here and there of white, also Filipino, and other and African Americans, right? Kind of coming in to help Japanese Americans either store their belongings, like look after their property, even manage their farm when they were gone. Unfortunately, though, I do feel that that was maybe the exception. Much more often, we do see, in some ways, a kind of like feeding frenzy for Japanese American property, belongings, businesses that are sold at rock bottom prices because they can't get anyone to help them. I've even found like ads, actually classified ads in the Seattle Times, like of people just coming and like selling Japanese American, farm equipment, furniture, right? Who just arrive and do this and kind of make money. So I think, unfortunately, what I do know is that the help that they received was not typical. But which is why it's important to uplift, I think, the stories of those people who kind of decided to go against the trend and actually really provide a helping hand to Japanese Americans, especially in the farming industry.
Um, Again, there's more gratitude, and people are so grateful for you making a personal appearance for the Heritage Museum. I would love to read our inclusion pledge at this time. As you were speaking, I felt just quite honored to be able to share with people the hour of learning. And at this museum, we reject racism, discrimination, and hate. Our purpose is to honor stories of love, oppression, action, and resilience. Stories that give voice to all, examine hard questions about social, economic, and environmental justice, and reveal racism and oppression within our heritage. We pledge that everything we do will honor the island's diversity of culture and histories. So, thank you.
Oh, thank you all so much. This was so great. And I love everything that you have said, Cameron. And I think it's great that you're moving in that direction. And yeah, I love that. So
Well,
it was
great.
wonderful to be here with you.
Thank you so much. And so we'll have this presentation on our website in the next days. And I want to thank all of our participants. We have just an amazing group of volunteer docents who have joined us today, and volunteers and just beloved community members. I'm happy to see all these beautiful and recognizable names on the screen. Thanks again, Megan. We look forward to learning more from you. And for anyone who hasn't read her book yet, please enjoy it. I read it right when it came out because I heard her on KUOW. And so thanks again, Megan. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Take care, everyone.
You too. Bye bye.